You're listening to Coffee and Culture on Talk 1260 and 103.7 KTRC, streaming at santafe.com. My name's Matthew Chase Daniel. I'm your host every other week. And today I'm talking with Tristan Duke. And Tristan has an exhibition that is up now at Site Santa Fe through March 17th. And he's an artist based in LA. And the show that's at site is called Glacial Optics, and it's sort of the short way of describing it is taking pictures in the Arctic of glaciers using ice as a lens for the photographs. And we'll get more into how that is and why that is as we talk. So welcome, Tristan.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Yeah. So you went, we'll talk a little bit later about projects that sort of led up to this, but in 2022, I believe you did a trip on a sailing vessel out of Svalbard or around that area Tell me about how that came to be and what you did up there.
Yeah, and actually, before we delve into that, I'll just give you kind of the broad overview that the show actually is comprised of three sort of chapters, if you will. And the first section is all of the work resulting from this Arctic expedition. And as you mentioned, the vision for that was using this unusual technology that I developed in my practice of making lenses out of ice, in this case, glacier ice, to sort of capture portraits of the glaciers through their own ice. So that's the first sort of chapter of this work. The second chapter is actually a lot of the work was made in New Mexico. After returning from the Arctic, I wanted to turn the ice lenses and this kind of climate consciousness that's a part of this project to look at effects of climate change closer to home. And so I started documenting wildfires across the American West. And so, part of this body of work is sort of an elemental investigation of fire and ice, but also sort of drawing lines between these unprecedented wildfires and the melting glaciers and the warming climate, the big picture. And then, so that's the second chapter. The third chapter of the work is making work looking at the ways that scientists are studying ice to understand our deep climate past and some of the climate science that's happening.
Right. There's both, so there's ice cores where I read a little bit about this in your show, but also there was just, I think, an Elizabeth Colbert article in the New Yorker a couple of weeks ago. I don't know if you read that. Yeah. About visiting Greenland and this polar station up there on the top at 10,000 feet or something. Just a fascinating article. And she goes into it a bit too, of these extremely long cores going deep, deep, deep into these glaciers that go back how long? Hundreds of years, thousands of years?
Yeah. So an ice core is essentially a sample, an ice sample, and they drill down into the glaciers to extract these usually 1 meter long section at a time. But these meter long sections fit together to form a continuous sort of cross section of the entire glacier. And that can be as deep as 2 miles. So if you can imagine like a series of cylinders of ice that fit together to make a continuous 2-mile stretch. And that extent represents usually, it depends on the exact location and glacier, but around 850,000 years is
goodness.
Longest continuous core sample record that we have.
Wow. So that's close to 1 million years. That's
and so that's
It's like sort of like dendrochronology when you look at tree rings and you can tell by the how much the tree grew each year going back over time and then linking today's tree to a tree from 50 years ago and back and back and back.
That's
And
exactly right.
you get a sense of the climate and the precipitation or the different conditions. But with ice, it's even more precise because there's elements that are held in the ice that were in the atmosphere at that time. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of precision, I'm not sure which is more precise, but I think that the big difference is that ice cores extend much further back. So the oldest tree ring, I'm not exactly up on what the oldest tree currently is. I think it's somewhere around 6,000 years, something like that. But 850,000 years is quite a bit more time. And there's different kinds of information that are recorded. One of the key things, though, is that ice actually traps little samples of air of the climate. And so it's really important tool because it's as if scientists have a time machine to be able to go back 850,000 years and bottle a little sample of air from that time.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So those drills are like it's a like a hole saw. It drills a cylinder. And
yeah, exactly.
That's so simple yet so amazingly fascinating, and the timeline is so long.
And I should mention the 850,000 years that I quoted. That's more, give or take what the sort of limit for continuous records, and that's where you're seeing every year basically going back. But scientists have recently unearthed even older ice that is sort of like anomalous and sort of out of place. And so some of the oldest ice being discovered right now is more in the order of 6 million years.
Wow.
So ice offers a really interesting kind of time capsule for storing climate data.
Right. And your work has, as you said, is focused on exploring our current climate change, climate catastrophe, through looking at the fires, looking at the ice, the two extremes of that. And so, yeah, I was interesting because when I was looking at using the ice to take photos of the ice is straightforward, not easy, but straightforward conceptually. And then using the ice to take pictures of the forest burn is sort of another level of that. But I like how those tie together because you can't take photos through charcoal. It's a little harder,
exactly.
Right? So how did you had this idea to make the photos using the ice before you went up there? It wasn't something you did, or did you do a trip to the Arctic and then come up with the idea? What's the process that brought it about?
So the idea was sort of born out of this kind of research that I had been doing before developing this technique of this ice lens. And actually, incidentally, the original seed of the idea was that I came across this reference to a Chinese alchemist from about 290 AD. And in this text, this alchemist describes using a ball of ice to focus the rays of the sun and start a fire. So much like you would use a magnifying glass to start a fire using the sun. And I basically was really intrigued by this idea. And so actually the first project, the first thing I did in this series of work was to repeat that alchemist's experiment, was to create a simple ice lens and then use that to start a fire.
And did that work?
Yes, it did. Yeah.
Oh, that's great. I love that. That's a great juxtaposition on makes perfect sense scientifically, but
Yeah.
creatively is like a big leap to think about.
Yeah. And, so, in my research, I've come across a couple different references to lenses made of ice through the historical record. And, one of always, though, seemingly appearing in experiments using these ice lenses to start fire, which, so Robert Hooke, one of the inventors of the microscope and, presented to the Royal Society in the 1600s, his attempts to start a fire using an ice lens. Descartes actually talks about ice lenses being used to start a fire. And it makes sense in this sense of like union of
heard of that
opposites.
before. Yeah, I love that.
Mhm.
I'm sorry to interrupt. We have to go to a break, but we'll be right back. My name's Matthew Chase Daniel. I'm talking to Tristan Duke. You're back listening to Coffee and Culture. We play at around just after 2 p.m. on Saturdays and Sundays on Talk 1260 and 103.7 KTRC out of Santa Fe, New Mexico. It streams at santafe.com, and then there's podcasts on whatever your podcast platform might be, and that's called Coffee and Culture with Matthew Chase Daniel. I'm talking to Tristan Duke today, who has a show up at Site Santa Fe that runs through March 17th, called Glacial Optics. He was just talking about a Chinese alchemist from a couple thousand years ago and other scientists who have been able to start fires using lenses made out of glass, which out of ice. So using ice to make fire, which is fascinating. And you did that.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, the next step for me was as a person who works with images, I wanted to see if I could use a lens made out of ice to make it in a camera to make an image. And this led to kind of a whole sort of a kind of poetic vision, if you will, of starting to imagine what such a perspective, because I became really interested in glacier ice, particularly. And glacier ice under the right conditions can be incredibly clear. It can be more clear even than pure diamond. And so I started kind of.
Is that because it's compressed under the weight of the glacier and it pushes out all of the air and?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
You see these photos like in the Antarctic or the Arctic of these icebergs that are this amazing clear and blue light, like we never see ice here in New Mexico.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And so, this, you're exactly right. It's the immense weight and pressure of the glacier that creates this incredibly clear ice. So I knew that it was possible that it could, that clear ice could exist. A big question going on this expedition was whether I could find that ice, because I would not be drilling miles into the glacier, drilling into the heart of the glacier using a coring tool. I would have to just work with what nature offered up willingly. And so, essentially when
it's hard to get the piece of ice out of the bottom where it's compressed.
Exactly. Yeah. The really old ice that's deep that can be really clear. So there were a lot of unknowns actually going into this trip. I had really no way of knowing whether I would be successful in this pursuit.
When I first heard about the project, I was imagining like a lens at first, the size of my Nikon 35 millimeter camera or digital camera. And then I was thinking about the lens on my iPhone. And then I saw your lenses, which are much bigger. And you're creating a camera in a tent, and your negatives are 4 feet by 6 feet, something like that. So it's a much bigger, it's reminiscent of a camera obscura kind of thing. And is that because of the meltability of the ice, it needs to be bigger? Is it because of the physical characteristics of ice that there's too many things that bounce around in a little piece of ice, so you need a bigger chunk? Or
No, actually, this was actually more of a creative aesthetic decision. I really wanted to, build a camera that sort of that invoked the scale of the glacier, and I wanted the resulting images to have that kind of physical presence and weight. And there is something about these really large images that when you step up to them, you can kind of imagine the scale of the scene that they depict in a way that I think a smaller photograph doesn't quite convey. And part of this project was that, I wanted to go and look this climate situation directly in the eye, but I also wanted to bring this kind of sort of bearing witness back to viewers who can't make that trip. And so a lot of this was about, investing in this like large format physicality, was about somehow, in a sense, bringing that aura or that presence of the place back to viewers here.
Yeah. Well, I think in this work and other work of yours that I've seen through your website, which is great, there seems to be a commitment to the photograph as a physical object. And so much now we see photos on our computer screens, or even worse, on our telephones. And that there's something to the physicality, both of the process and of that size and of that directness. Like you're capturing this, you could have set it up to capture on a digital capture or something, but you're setting it on this massive, I assume, paper negative, and then that's used to rephotograph to print, or
So actually these prints that are on display at Site Santa Fe are actually they're contact prints made from the giant negatives that were actually captured in the Arctic. So it's an all darkroom process, and normally you would do enlargements, but in this case, the negatives are already so big that it's just a one-to-one contact print.
Right. So you're printing in the Arctic, you're printing on a transparent film, not on a paper.
Actually, they were paper negatives, but the paper is transparent enough that when you lay that paper negative on top of a fresh sheet of paper and shine light through the back, you can create a really nice contact print.
Oh, that's great. I didn't imagine that. I like that. And is that paper, those big 4x6 paper negatives, is that paper that you treat to make those negatives, or is that something that's available commercially?
No, so for this project, I do in other projects mix my own emulsion and coat my own materials. But for this project, I'm working with the same kind of enlarging paper that you would use in a darkroom to print a photograph. And you can still buy these kinds of papers on really large rolls. That's how they're manufactured. And so I'm just taking advantage of that existing material.
Yeah. Yeah, I was wondering about that.
But just to kind of underscore for your listeners, part of the precarity and sort of challenge of this project was transporting these huge rolls of film. They're actually they're about 3.5 feet tall and 8 feet wide was the size that I was working with. And to transport them, they're light sensitive materials. So I had to keep them in light tight, large plastic tubes that, at every step of the way, traveling around the world, airport security and customs officials were threatening to open. And of course, I couldn't develop these until getting back to my studio in Los Angeles. So there was quite a bit of risk involved in this trip.
Right. Yeah. And I imagine a lot of unknown, like you shot these photos up there and you're on a sailboat, and to get back is a long way. It's not like you can go back and reshoot. So that must have
Exactly.
been amazing once you did develop them and they worked and they were real.
And part of the beauty for me of these kind of experimental and analog processes is that you're inviting chance and sort of the situation to be a collaborator in the process. So again, there were a lot of unknowns, but that's also part of what gives the images a lot of their creative energy. Things happen along the
Yeah.
way, and everything from whatever particular ice I ended up finding and how well that focused an image to be able to work as a lens, to light leaks in the tent, and all sorts of things. The negatives bear the marks of the adventure, and that's what's really interesting to me, is that they become documents that actually speak to the adventure that took place.
Yeah. We have to go to another break. We'll be right back. You're listening to Coffee and Culture, and I'm talking with Tristan Duke, who has a show at Site Santa Fe right now. You're back listening to Coffee and Culture. We play on Talk 1260, 103.7 KTRC in Santa Fe, streaming at santafe.com. Podcasts also available. My name is Matthew Chase Daniel. I'm talking to Tristan Duke, who has a show at Site Santa Fe in the front there through March 17th. And the big tent that Tristan made and used in the Arctic is there in the lobby, so you can see the whole process. And there's a lot of you're talking about this sort of physicality of the work and the mark of the adventure and light leaks or fold in the paper, whatever it might be, in the process of making this. But there also seems like you use a lot of the techniques of technology and science to explore things, and there was maybe 3D printing or CNC machining to make molds for the ice, and I sort of love, there's always a lot of desire on the part of different people to do sort of these blends of art and science, and sometimes it's art illustrating scientific things, and sometimes it's artists and scientists trying to work on projects together. But I was really impressed with your work, is that you're using the tools of technology and science in a way as part of your artistic investigation. And to me, people think artists are really creative and scientists are really dry and not creative. But I think a lot of the process is the same. It's creative thought, ideas, and then problem solving to prove or disprove those ideas in science, or create a work that can communicate those things in art. And I like the way you're blending those things. And just tell me a little bit about your scientific process in making all of this.
I couldn't agree with you more. I think that actually many of the scientists that I've worked with, the interesting thing is that the scientists, the really the scientists that are at the top of their fields, I've discovered are really some of the most creative people that I've had the opportunity to work with. But in terms of the blending of art and science, it's never really made sense to me to kind of draw these lines, these boundaries between fields of knowledge. I think of them almost as kind of different lenses. There's a scientific lens, there's a poetic lens, an artistic lens, and I think they're all just different ways of seeing and understanding our world. And I think the more that we can build a certain kind of fluency to move between these different perspectives, it informs our view of the world and adds depth to our understanding. So my artist practice is kind of a vehicle for my sort of blend of research, historical research, scientific research, and technical invention and innovation. And I bring these things together in a kind of investigation of our world.
Yeah. It's inspiring. And you've worked with on this project with a lot of I'm looking at the website, the National Science Foundation Ice Core Facility and the Byrd Polar Climate Research Center and the Wisconsin IceCube Particle Astrophysics Center. So these like important research places that are you're able to work with on this project. So one of these things I was reading, and I want to hear about this, where these scientists drill these huge cores and then drop these sensors in there that can sensor neutrinos and then refreeze them in the ice, fill it up with water,
Yeah.
I guess, or whatever. So they're frozen in the ice because these neutrino particles, which are some rare, very hard to detect particles, maybe everything else is filtered out except them in deep ice.
Exactly. Yeah. So this collaboration, this sort of branch of the work came out of my reading about the IceCube Neutrino Telescope, Neutrino Observatory, which is this completely outrageous project that is happening right now. It's in the South Pole. It's actually a telescope, if you will, that uses a cubic kilometer of crystal clear glacier ice almost as a lens in order to image these cosmic neutrinos, these really hard to detect subatomic particles. So a couple years back, I basically had a conversation with the folks at IceCube and said, essentially, you have a giant telescope that uses an entire glacier kind of like a big lens. And I'm doing this project where I'm building cameras that use ice as a lens. Maybe we have something to talk about. And lo and behold, within a year, they brought me out to do a residency there where I was able to document some of their particle sensors, which are designed to be embedded deep inside the glacier using my ice lenses. So that was a really exciting collaboration. And, for me, this was an exciting thing because in a way, IceCube Neutrino Observatory is sort of realizing what one of the things that was in a literal sense, one of the things that I originally envisioned in a poetic sense of kind of imagining the glacier itself as having a gaze, or thinking about what would be the perspective of the glacier if we imagined it as being sort of a naturally occurring lens in a sense. So that was pretty exciting.
So you went down there to the South Pole or to the Antarctica?
I haven't been to the South Pole station yet. That's actually one of the things on my to-do list. I would love to get down there. It's a little more challenging to get to the South Pole than to the northern Arctic regions, which are, more accessible.
Right.
For that project, I worked with the folks. IceCube is managed out of Madison, Wisconsin, University of Wisconsin-Madison there. So I visited their labs there and was able to take photographs of the new sensors that they're building before they shipped out to Antarctica.
That makes sense. Does sound a little easier. I've always been fascinated by these residencies at the South Pole, in Antarctica, or on a freighter crossing the ocean, or strange art residencies. But I haven't been. Sounds cold. And so also so some of your lenses, ice lenses, are made from glaciers, and I assume when you were traveling around there in the Arctic making those photos, you made different lenses as you traveled around, like those don't last long.
Exactly. Which of
And
course depends on how cold it is outside. In some cases in the Arctic, a single lens could last, potentially indefinitely. But I might decide to switch the lens because I wanted to work with ice from that particular glacier, for example. But working in an environment like New Mexico or Colorado, the ice lenses can melt quite rapidly.
right. And so there's two ways of making the lens, one from the glacier, one from the local water. Oh, we have to go to our last break. So we're going to talk about that when we get back. We're talking with Tristan Duke on Coffee and Culture. You're back listening to Coffee and Culture. I'm talking to Tristan Duke about his show that's at Site Santa Fe, and we were talking about two different ways of making lenses out of ice, one from glaciers and one from water. How do you do it?
Yeah, so in the Arctic, the entire idea was to work with this ancient glacier ice as found, and to make lenses literally out of that ice. And the way that I do it is I have these custom-made ice presses, which are essentially metal dies that are machined with the curvature of the lens. I put these metal dies into a hot water bath to warm them up, and then I press them into the ice, and they essentially reductively sculpt the ice by melting it.
So they melt the ice, and then there's still ice in the shape.
Yeah,
Nice.
exactly. It melts away everything but the shape of this lens.
Nice.
But for the work back in the U.S., once I got home, I did bring some Arctic ice back with me. But
did you keep it frozen?
Actually, the way I did that was I hadn't planned to do this, but when I was in the Arctic and flying back, I figured, well, over the course of 26 hours, there's only so much that this big block of ice can melt. So I just put the biggest chunk of ice that I could fit in my carry-on suitcase into my bag. And by the time I got back to LA, it was, probably 60% of the size where it started. But I still have a pretty large chunk of clear glacier ice that I brought
fantastic. Back. So was your carry-on dripping all over the plane as you're walking around?
It got a little bit wet. I wrapped it in some plastic bags, but it is actually, in fact, true for people who are wondering. What TSA told me, and this is literally what they said. They said, well, as long as it's a solid, it's okay. Any liquid part that melts off, you may have to pour off at different security checkpoints, but you can carry as much ice as you want as long as it's a solid.
Oh, right, because you're not allowed to bring any liquids more than a few ounces. But if it's
exactly,
solid, that's hilarious. I think didn't Olafur Eliasson, I imagine you know his work.
Yeah.
Didn't he bring some icebergs to the Paris Climate Summit a number of years ago and put them on the street and they were melting there?
Exactly. He was able to carry much bigger ice chunks than my carry-on bag allowance.
Yeah, I always wondered how he moved those around like that. But I love that you brought it back.
To return to your point from before, for the New Mexico work and for work in Colorado and California documenting these wildfires, I actually opted to use clear ice, which I made from local water. And part of the reason for this is that I really wanted to have this sense of some of the material from that very landscape be involved in the process. And in the case of these wildfires, I think, the connections that you could draw from thinking about, these dropping water tables and increasing droughts and wildfire and the big connections to melting glaciers and warming climate. So I wanted to kind of invoke that larger network.
Yeah. When those fires were burning up above Las Vegas, was that, a year or two ago?
Yeah.
I live on the outskirts of Santa Fe. You know, whenever there's big fires, you see these big helicopters that go down to the lakes on the Rio Grande, Cochiti, and scoop up big sacks of water, and they're in a sort of a hammock hanging below the helicopter, and then go dump it. And so there's
Absolutely.
also that sort of
I should also
water and
mention about that particular fire. So I did document the aftermath. I was actually photographing as the Calf Canyon Hermit's Peak fire was still burning. And one of the things that I discovered later, which seems kind of strangely relevant to this project, is that part of how the Calf Canyon fire started, or the cause of the Calf Canyon fire, is it was what's called a holdover fire, which means in this case, actually, the Forest Service was doing a controlled burn, and there were some embers left. And then actually snow had fallen and covered those embers. And somehow the embers reemerged from out of the snow. And so kind of another way in which fire emerged from ice there in that fire.
yeah, I many years ago, I used to have horses, and I had a big manure pile, and I cleaned out my fireplace ashes and dumped. The manure pile was covered in thick snow, and I dumped the ashes, which I thought were cold ashes, on the manure pile on the snow, figuring because they were cold and because there was all that ice and snow, it would be fine. And 2 days later, my neighbor knocked on my door at 6 in the morning and said, "There's something burning down here," and the whole manure pile had slowly caught fire and was just smoldering away. And it took me hours and hours of flipping it over and hosing it down to get it out. It was another one of those ice and fire moments. I wanted to talk about a couple more things. We're almost out of time, but you did a talk at Site Santa Fe, a conversation with Lawrence Weschler. And that, I believe, will be on Site Santa Fe's website, so people can stream that if they weren't able to attend that, which I wasn't because I was out of town. And he's a brilliant, fascinating thinker, and I've read lots of his books. And so that's something to look forward. Was that a nice experience?
Absolutely.
Had you met him before, or was this a new meeting?
Yeah. So I've known Lawrence for many years. He's been a long time, supporter of my work, and we've had a long ongoing conversation over the years. So it was great to continue that conversation in a public forum with him. And yes, as you said, that conversation will be posted soon on the Site Santa Fe website and social media. So stay tuned for that.
Yeah. And I saw that when I saw that you were talking with him, and then I saw on your website that you also did some project using objects from the Museum of Jurassic Technology, which he wrote a great book about many years ago. So there's connections through there.
Yeah, the Museum of Jurassic Technology. For many years, I had my studio in the back rooms of the Museum of Jurassic Technology here in LA. So they've been great friends and supporters over the years, part of my community here, and they're doing amazing things. Actually, they just opened a new sort of wing on the museum that's looking at sacred geometries and sort of Islamic sacred architecture and so forth, which is part of the Getty Pacific Standard Time programming. So if you're in LA, come to the Jurassic and check out what they're doing.
Venice Boulevard near the 405 somewhere.
Yep.
And then Radius Books is publishing a book of your work, and is this of the Site Santa Fe show, or is it broader? Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I have a book forthcoming from Radius, and that's going to be coming out sometime in the spring of 2025. So coming right up, and this book deals with the larger glacial optics project. So it's not a catalog for the site show, strictly speaking, but it's addressing the larger project of which the site show is also treating. So um, it should be I think it's been really great experience working with them, and they make beautiful books. So
Yeah.
I'm very excited. Yeah.
And that'll be a combination of images and text, I imagine.
Yeah, so we have some text and images as well, and I think we're gonna it's still taking shape, but we're gonna be including some of my almost kind of field notes, which are kind of a mix of sort of travel log and sort of the telling the story of the adventures, but also some of the research and the interesting intellectual or places of the mind that these adventures in the world have taken me.
Yeah, well, I'm glad to hear that, because your work is rich in both the visual and the conceptual and the description and the adventure and the science and all of that. So I'm glad that that's all coming in the book. We're out of time. You've been listening to Coffee and Culture. Matthew Chase Daniel talking with Tristan Duke. His show, Glacial Optics, is at Site Santa Fe through March 17th. And there's a book coming from Radius and a talk with Tristan and Lawrence Weschler on Site Santa Fe's website should be up soon. So check it out. Thank you so much for spending the time with us, Tristan.
Thank you, Matthew.